And welcome. This is The Mint, Zimbabwe's premier business show. I'm Andy Hodges. Live from ZTN studios in Harare, Zimbabwe. Our discussion this evening: is Zimbabwe ready for the new world order? This broadcast is brought to you by Zimpaper's TV network, ZTN. Now, should you have any comments or views, as usual, please post them on our Facebook page, Zimpaper's TV network, or via our Twitter handle @ZTN News. The 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP26, recently came to an end. Its aim was to get countries worldwide to unite in the fight against climate change. Climate change issues are likely to hit African countries the hardest, though the continent is the least responsible for driving climate change. The planet is already 1.1 degrees Celsius warmer than in pre-industrial times, and the temperature is rising. According to the United Nations Environment Programme, there is a 50-50 chance that global warming will exceed 1.5 degrees centigrade in the next 2 decades. According to the African Group of Negotiators, the main African agenda items at COP26 were as follows: climate responsibility. Developed nations have to take their responsibilities and lead the way to reaching zero emissions by 2050. Climate finance and adaptation. Developed nations have to mobilize enough funds to finance adaptation in developing countries that are adversely affected by climate change. Finance architecture and transparency mechanisms should be put in place. Transfer of technologies and capacity building. Developed nations must transfer sound environmental technologies to African countries for effective climate adaptation, mitigation, and transition. And finally, long-term climate financing. Developed nations have to meet their pre-2020 commitment of $100 billion United States dollars per year and agree on long-term climate financing. So here on The Mint we ask, did African countries meet their objectives at COP26? What specifically was Zimbabwe asking for at COP26, and what can Zimbabwe do in the war against climate change? Is the world actually serious about fighting climate change? And why should African countries pay for the climate misdeeds of industrial nations? Join us on The Mint tonight to discuss, is Zimbabwe ready for the new world order? We are joined in the studio by Honorable Mangaliso Ndlovu, Zimbabwe's Minister of Environment, Climate, Tourism and Hospitality Industry. Minister, welcome to The Mint.
Thank you, Andy.
Minister, you attended COP26 recently in Glasgow. What was your overall view of it from the government of Zimbabwe's perspective? Was it a success or failure?
Thank you so much, Andy. COP26 means it's the 26th Conference of Parties. It means we have held a Conference of Parties over the years. We only missed 2020 because of the COVID-19 pandemic, so the UK had to postpone it by a year. And I might want to maybe bring some bit of background to this. As you have just highlighted, we have warmed our temperatures by 1.1 above pre-industrial levels, meaning that before industrialization came in, we had harmony with our nature. But industrialization saw the use of fossil fuels, mainly extracted from Africa, but also from the so-called developed countries today. And this was done unsustainably so over the years. And most developed countries really developed on the back of these fossil fuels. And the debate around climate change has been on for around 35 years. We saw the first adoption of the framework UNFCCC in 1992, where countries came together and agreed that we have to work together to combat climate change. Zimbabwe, despite being a net carbon sink, meaning we are absorbing carbon more than we are emitting, we became parties in 1994, 2 years after the framework came into being. And this just shows how committed we are in terms of tackling global issues, especially this very important one. Now, over the years, we have seen the discussions gather momentum. We saw the Kyoto Protocol that came through, agreed in 1997, the Paris Agreement in 2015. If these measures were not taken, scientists are saying that by end of this century, we would have warmed temperatures by more than 6 degrees Celsius. No. So when we look at it, again, scientists are saying Kyoto Protocol was a step in the right direction. We were able to project lower temperatures by around 4 degrees Celsius. the Paris Agreement came in 2015 and introduced what we call the national determined contributions, where countries make their own commitments of what they will do specifically on emissions reductions. And those commitments further lowered the projections for temperature increase to around 2.8 degrees Celsius. Again, it's not enough. The rate at which temperatures are increasing, if by end of century it's 2.8 degrees warmer than pre-industrial levels, we have a lot of small islands that would be swallowed by rising water levels.
And we're already at 1.1, so it isn't that far away, is it?
We're already seeing the evidence of what's happening. Extreme weather patterns that we are seeing, be it prolonged droughts, be it floods. We have experienced that as Zimbabwe. And our call, as you rightfully put it there, as Africa, is that the developed countries who continue to emit massive greenhouse gases into the atmosphere need to take bold steps to halt their emissions, but also support the developing countries in coping with the consequences of what they are doing.
So COP26, success or failure?
Look, I've said we have had, this was the 26th conference, and in each conference there are negotiations that take place. What has been the approach is that it has to be more voluntary than regulatory. There were a number of positives, and certainly there are areas where I think we could have done a lot better. Positives for me, among them, is the clear commitment by the developed countries of net zero emissions by mid-century, by 2050. What this means for me is that they are establishing a direct link between their emissions and their ability to absorb the emissions. So the net zero means they will be absorbing exactly the amount that they are emitting. While it's a good start, it's not good enough, in my view, because they need to really go beyond absorbing what they are emitting. They need to absorb way, way more than they are emitting. They've already led us to where we are today. And we need to be bold and tell them the truth, that it is not good enough, but it's the first time that they've been bold in committing to this. We also had them also coming up with more ambitious promises on financing.
I'll get to that later, yeah.
So it came out in COP26. There is more commitment for more funding. Our plea is always that for Africa, we want more funding towards adaptation than mitigation. When you're talking of net zero emissions by 2050, as Zimbabwe, we are emitting far less than we are absorbing. So does it mean we put on hold our plans to reduce emissions? Certainly not. We do need to commit towards mitigation, but adaptation becomes quite essential. A number of negatives. Again, we believe that as Africa first, that's my view, we go into these very important international platforms divided, or we do not establish a common position way, way in advance, which is scientifically backed, and take a common position. Again, it is explained maybe by our economies. In the southern African region, you realize that our electricity is mainly thermal. So almost 80% of our electricity is from coal-related thermal. Whereas when you go to a country like Kenya, they've moved in terms of renewable energy. I think it's close to 90% of their energy. So when we find ourselves in a global platform and we have not established common positions, our position is weaker. But I'm happy to say that Kenya really stood with Africa. Again, when you look at African-specific issues, and Zimbabwe in this case, there are issues to do with loss and damage, where we are pleading with the developed countries to put funds that are relating to addressing losses that the developing countries are incurring. Zimbabwe spent close to 10% of its GDP in addressing the tragedy that befell us in Chimanimani and Chipinge. Certainly that slows our development trajectory, and we're saying that the developed countries need to come to the party. Yeah.
Minister, at the beginning of COP26, over 25 African leaders spoke in Glasgow to demand climate justice. I believe Zimbabwe's President Idi Mnangagwa was one of those leaders. Despite calls for climate finance, funding for adaptation, as you mentioned, and drastic emission cuts from rich nations, critics say that few of their requests feature in the final agreement announced on the 13th of November 2021. So let me ask you directly, what is the resistance or the alleged resistance, as alleged by commentators and critics, from some members of the world community in truly fighting climate change and helping other less wealthy nations to do the same? Is there a resistance? It appears from a commentator's perspective that there actually is.
Look, for me, I think the starting point is really for Africa to do its homework, thorough homework. The developed countries go in there having done their research, mainly scientific, and they know what they want out of this. First, they want to make a lot of noise about their commitments towards emissions reduction, their commitment towards financing mitigation and adaptation. But when you go into the detail, you realize that there is a good chance that we are being sold a fallacy. And I will say so because we have argued that we need to establish a fund which will be under the Global Green Climate Fund, where there is transparency on how this fund is tapped into by the nations. But they would want to go more on bilateral cooperating platforms where we know they would politicize this, and in the end we lose the fight against climate change.
I mean, it looks like to become more of a commercial transaction, some of these deals. So they'll give money for climate change, if they can call it that, but however, it's their technicians, their people, their workers that have to come in and do the projects that they're giving money for. So it's a win-win for them to a certain degree.
Certainly. What is the strategy, in my view, is that the developed countries want to dictate the pace at which these negotiations take place. It's more like the developing countries have to be perpetually victims of this. And I believe that needs to be realigned because they are the biggest emitters. We need to say, we are there to fight this with you, despite you having benefited from this. And you realize that the funding that they will be committing, as you correctly put it, it is benefiting them more in the main because it will be their companies that will be coming to set up. And it is not supplementing our development trajectory. I will tell you, I know you'll talk about coal later on, that there's so much talk about solar power. We know as a country that it is not a sustainable trajectory to take at this point. It is very expensive.
For our development needs.
Yes, it is not sustainable. It's quite expensive. When you look at power storage needs, we certainly cannot match that.
Well, let's get into that now. I mean, nearly 200 nations have agreed to adopt the Glasgow Climate Pact after more than 2 weeks of intense negotiations, with the United Kingdom, the host of the talks, saying the agreement will keep alive international hopes of averting the worst impacts of global warming. The pact covers such issues, amongst many others, of preventing planetary warming from exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius, which you mentioned earlier. It asks countries to reduce their reliance on coal and roll back fossil fuel subsidies, and deal made some headway on the demands of poor and vulnerable countries that wealthy countries responsible for most emissions pay up. But what was exactly in the Glasgow Pact, and what is in it that directly can impact Zimbabwe?
Thank you. Well, the first one, I think it was the main issue coming out of that phasing down as opposed to phasing out of coal. It is the first time that coal is mentioned in the output document of a conference of parties.
In fact, let me quote you. I mean, they say that one of the contentious issues that you mentioned was that around asking countries to reduce their reliance on coal. However, side deals were also made at COP26 between the United States and the European Union, spearheading a global methane cutting initiative, in which around 100 countries have promised to reduce methane emissions by 30% from 2020 levels by 2030. Now, as you know, Zimbabwe is a large coal producer. Some would say heavily reliant on coal. In fact, some or most of Zimbabwe's electricity generation is coal-based. Zimbabwe also has a large reserves of methane gas that are open to exploitation, and we've tried to exploit them, I believe, in the past here. What was and is Zimbabwe's position on these issues? Because India, for example, requested that the deal call on countries to phase down instead of phase out unabated coal. So your comment to that?
So while India came out as the one who really ran with this, they were representing what we call the Group of 77 plus China, which we are part of. And that was a position that we had discussed earlier. Our view is that we are agreeable that we need to address the issues of fossil fuels if we are to tame our emissions. But we need to do so in a responsible manner. There are so many disruptions that will take place. But there was this push to phase out coal. And when we go into discussions and say, okay, let's look at the impact of these response measures. How does it impact communities? In Zimbabwe, for instance, we still have huge electricity deficit. We are sitting at around 44% access. And currently, from what we are generating, I think it's about 40 to 45% of our electricity is coming from Wange and small thermals. You cut that, you have retarded our economic growth. So for Zimbabwe, we are clear that we have 26 billion metric tons of coal, which can last us for more than 850 years. But at the same time, we are committed to the issues of climate change, which is why in our NDCs, by the way, we have committed to reduce by 40% our emissions by 2030, which is quite an ambitious target. But we get worried when there is selective targeting of fossil fuels. For instance, we have about 10,000 ships in the waters every day. But there was not much mention of the oil that they are burning when they are in the seas. The rate at which coal is being highlighted, again, it shows that there is not enough sincerity in this.
Are you saying it suits the industrialized nations' agenda to talk about issues that really may not 100% affect them all that way, but also ignore other issues that really they have a problem with getting rid of?
Most certainly, they're buying time until they transition to e-mobility, and they will then bring to the fore the issues of oils and the like. A lot of them now have got nuclear power stations, so those who relied heavily on coal have been able to transition. And that's why our advocacy position is that we need to put just transition. We need to analyze so that we don't disrupt livelihoods and we don't slow down economic development for other countries.
Now, you mentioned the Kyoto Protocol earlier, which was, of course, an international treaty which extended the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC, that commits state parties to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It would appear, however, as critics state, that the Kyoto Protocol was not really fully implemented, as can be seen by the continuing increase in greenhouse gas emissions, and I suppose in a way also the increases in temperatures. So why should climate agreements, they allege, continue to be negotiated and made when they are never really fully implemented? Is this, as they again say, just political theatre?
I think to understand this better, there's a bit of background to the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol targeted mainly the developed countries and made them commit to emissions reductions, but also to support the developing countries by, that's where we established the issue of the carbon credits. The major weakness of the Kyoto Protocol, as it would appear, was that, one, China, which is the biggest emitter in the world, is regarded as a developing country. So it was therefore not compelled to make commitments to reduce emissions. Secondly, the US now, citing that, decided not to be party of...
Because China wasn't doing it, we're not going to do it.
So they were not party to the Kyoto Protocol, the US. So we had the world's two biggest emitters not party to the Kyoto Protocol. I think that brought in some bit of challenges.
That's just proving the point that this is political theatre then.
It does. And the pressure to then put all the countries in the climate change agenda culminated in the Paris Agreement. Agreement in 2015.
Which the US eventually pulled out of anyway under President Trump.
Under President Trump. But President Obama had brought the US into the table under the Paris Agreement, again indicating that they don't want to acknowledge that they are playing a big role in their missions. So again, I want to look at the Kyoto Protocol as having laid a fundamental foundation into the Paris Agreement, because from that there was so much progress from other countries, especially in developing projects that meant really to curtail greenhouse gas emissions. If you remember, I had mentioned that if we had not done anything to do with mitigation, we would have had a 6 degrees Celsius temperature increase. Kyoto slowed that to around 4 degrees Celsius. The Paris Agreement to around 2.8. So again, there is role
and
that
hopefully the Glasgow will move it down to below 2%, hopefully.
Yeah, well, from the NDCs submitted, we still think that we are sitting on around 2.4 degrees Celsius,
which is too high.
Which is still too high, and there's need to continue to negotiate. That's why this is every year.
Yeah, I want to go back to my original question. I asked you, was the COP26 a success or failure? Because various media reports indicate that, in fact, it was a failure. And I quote this: the Glasgow Climate Pact, adopted by almost 200 countries after 2 intense weeks of negotiations, will not radically alter the global landscape on climate change. And that was said by the United Nations Secretary General himself, Antonio Guterres, at the conclusion of the conference. He continued to say, the outcome of COP26 is a compromise. It reflects the interests, the contradictions, and the state of political will in the world today. It is an important step, but it is not enough. Minister, climate activists in the world saw COP26 as a vital conference for all nations to agree on what steps to take to fight climate change. It appears the reality is far from that. Your views?
Look, it will be viewed as a success or failure depending on the expectations going into COP26. We have attended quite a number of these, and we know that there is a lot of politics taking place. So we're not overly optimistic. But I would understand the Secretary General's position. In COP25, in his closing remarks, he did highlight that there is need to move away from coal. So I guess that is where his expectation mainly would have been. Certainly, climate change, for it to be addressed, there are a lot of issues that have to be put into consideration. And unless all the concerns are taken on board, there will be parties that will feel that there is not enough progress. Like I have said, we had a number of breakthroughs, and I want to credit the British government that they had the world discuss climate change when we were in Glasgow. The publicity was quite high. We managed to solve Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which is the rule book. It had been outstanding ever since. And for us, that was a major breakthrough. And again, like I had already highlighted, that for the developed countries to highlight the net zero emissions target by 2050. That was a milestone on its own. There are major issues for Africa, as I've highlighted, loss and damage, the issues of the impact of response measures, more funding towards adaptation and resilience building in communities. These are not coming out, and this is where the developed world needs to come.
I will talk about the funding, Minister. It's just after this. You're watching The Mint, Zimbabwe's premier The Mint, Zimbabwe's premier business show. Our discussion this evening: is Zimbabwe ready for the new world order? This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Paper's TV network, ZTN. Minister, one of the African negotiators' agenda items, of course, was with regards to long-term climate financing. Developing nations have to meet their pre-2020 commitment of 100 billion United States dollars per year and agree on long-term climate financing. The deal, for example, the Glasgow deal, urges developed countries, parties to at least double their collective provisions of climate finance for adaptation to developing country parties from 2019 levels by 2025. But in reality, it appears, according to commentators, that in fact developed countries have essentially just agreed to continue discussions on the topic. Simply put, they say that African countries should not expect any funds from developing nations. Your opinion and comment?
The issue of financing is central in climate change, in the climate change fight. And we are quite disappointed that this is not gaining enough traction, which will see the world take bold steps in reducing emissions. But again, we need to break it further, because if we are not careful, in the next few years, we'll have a lot of developing countries heavily indebted to the developed countries because of the climate financing. Yes, they had committed to contribute 100 billion annually from 2020. But the question is, in what form is the developing world accessing these funds? Are they grants? Are they loans? If they are loans, at what cost is it? And what is the tenure?
So just increase the debt burden.
Yeah, that is the debt burden coming, and I foresee climate debt burden in the next few years if we are not careful. But that said, during COP26, there were a number of firm commitments. First is to acknowledge that that commitment, that pledge which they made, has to be met. So by 2025, we agreed that the developed countries would have availed 500 billion, which will still translate to 100 billion annually. But also we saw countries like the US, Canada and others pledging to increase what they had pledged. So we hope that by 2024, thereabout, there should be more funds availed towards...
On concessionary financing, or just as grants or as pledges?
So that detail is not very clear, and they were not willing to come out to the open.
That's why they talk about discussions on the topic, continuing discussions.
And here is our concern. They say that in 2020, there was about 79 billion that was availed, and you cannot trace it. It's not transparent. They will tell you that it was channeled through NGOs and all that. Unless we are able to trace where these funds are going, we will have different positions, and this is not helping the cooperation that we envisage going forward.
Minister, a critical question, a fundamental question that commentators ask is, why should Africa or less developed nations pay for the climate misdeeds of industrial countries?
I don't believe we should. And I commend the African nations and other developing countries that despite them not having contributed anything towards the dire situation we find ourselves in, they have gone on to submit very ambitious emissions reductions, which impair, in a way, their development agenda. But that just shows that they are responsible global citizens. We will then expect that the developed countries, knowing fully well the role that they played in this, to meet the developing countries halfway and really support them, so that this does not in any way seen as them throwing away the ladder they used to climb, so that the developing countries don't reach them.
Exactly.
We want to see that as them coming to the party, supporting this transition. There are so many green jobs that can be created, but the biggest question will always be, what are the support mechanisms? Technology transfer, is it coming? Is it enough? And this is not coming out clear. That's the tragedy.
What exactly are Zimbabwe's policies to ensure that the country plays its part in the fight against climate change and, of course, environmental degradation?
So Zimbabwe has done quite a lot from our climate change policy, which is already in place. You will know that last year we also launched a climate change mainstreaming strategy, where we have partnered with the universities in all our provinces to train provincial development committees to mainstream climate change in their development planning annually. Because of the devolution funding, we expect that whatever plans they come up with should speak to issues of climate change. We have seen changes in our drought patterns. I think some years back we used to have drought every 10 years. It then became once every 5 years. It's now almost pretty much second or third year. So we are working on that to make sure that we are mainstreaming climate change in our planning. From the energy side, we've got the renewable energy policy, which we came up with. We have the e-mobility policy that is under consideration at various stages, where we are working with the Minister of Energy. The climate smart agriculture, the Fumvudza one again. These are the strategies that we are implementing to try and address this. But more importantly, we'll know that just before we went to COP26, we launched our national determined contributions with an ambitious 40% target reduction by 2030, and a low emission development strategy, which again is a 40% target expanded to 2050. These are classified with specific actions. Our NTCs have 17 specific actions, which include, among others, increasing our energy efficiency. We believe that if we are efficient in our energy utilization and we minimize the losses in transmission, we will rely less on unsustainable sources of energy. We have 38 actions that we have identified in the low emission development strategy. Again, we are clear that we are party to the fight against climate change, and we have committed as a country to fight this.
You know, Zimbabweans sometimes, I believe, sort of see climate change as an ethereal thing, something that's happening somewhere else. But it's right here, right now, is it not?
I mean, it is. We have had some scientists, unfortunately, who have given contradicting views, but it's clear that climate change is here. We have experienced it. You did mention the issue of droughts. We have had extreme weather patterns. I think every Zimbabwean has been affected one way or the other by the effects of climate change. You know, the first rains this year, where I come from, blew the roofs of more than 4 schools, and this was nationwide. It tells you that where we are now, nature is responding at the same rate at which we have been communicating to it, and we need to change that.
I want to look now at the environment, because some critics state that although Zimbabwe has what can be called robust environmental laws and policies in place, the implementation leaves a lot to be desired, and countrywide they are being regularly flouted, particularly by allegedly large corporations, especially in the mining sector. You know, they talk about wash off going into rivers, not environmental mining and so forth. I just use the mining sector as an example. Do you believe this is a true statement or not?
And that's a difficult question to respond to. But what we have seen really is that we are a nation endowed with a lot of resources, natural resources, minerals and others. And we need to be vigilant in how we extract these resources. I must say that we have made significant strides, especially working with the Minister of Mines, in the last year to 2 in trying to address a lot of these issues. If you have been following, we introduced what we call the orderly mining initiatives, where now it will be mandatory for one to submit their environmental compliance certificates to the Ministry of Mines every year before the mining title is renewed. Our observation is that largely the big mining companies are compliant with environmental laws. Yes, time and again, they need to be pushed to improve their standards. That is because most of them are international companies, and they don't want the reputation of being of extracting minerals in an environmentally unsustainable manner. Where we have a problem is really small to medium scale mining. A lot of it is illegal, and we seem to be having gaps, especially in terms of enforcement. We can only enforce from an environmental perspective registered mining operations, because it is through an EIA, and your conformance to the EIA that we assess. But somebody will just take up tools and they dig up, they move.
I mean, some statistics I've seen is a huge influx of mercury, for example, going into the groundwater supply, which of course has a huge impact on the health of Zimbabwean citizens. I mean, these are critical issues. So what do you intend to do about this small and medium sector? Because obviously you can't just ignore it and let them continue doing what they're doing.
Again, we have moved way ahead in that. If you remember, we ratified the Minamata Convention, and we're already working with the artisanal small-scale miners on the transition. The Minister of Mines, as the technical advisor, are already working on alternatives to mercury. There were shocking studies that were done in Kadoma, where we were beginning to see the traces of that in women's breastfeeding, and this has huge health impacts into our populations. And I'm happy that we are making progress in terms of making sure that we adopt technologies that are environmentally friendly. And the Ministry of Mines have indicated that they are bigger mines that are not reliant on mercury, and we believe that it can be used widely in our mining.
Because, I mean, the reason why I bring the environment into this, because there is a link between environment and, I suppose, to a certain degree, climate change.
Yes,
I mean,
yes,
whatever that is. I mean, maybe you could elaborate on that?
Most certainly. When we are unsustainably exploiting resources, we are indiscriminately cutting trees, we are reducing the ability of the climate, the ability of the environment to mitigate on climate issues. For instance, trees are our biggest bet in
deforestation.
absorbing the carbon that is emitted. And we see massive deforestation, especially in tobacco growing areas, for instance. But we just need to reorganize ourselves, because in terms of policy, I think we have sound policies. We have got the tobacco levy, which ought to be channeled entirely towards tree planting. We have what we call the Tobacco Wood Energy Program, where we are planting exotic trees which are early maturity, really meant for these areas where they'll then start using those for processing tobacco.
But there's a bit of an irony, though, because you say that the tree cutting or deforestation in tobacco growing areas, but then if you don't do that, you have to use coal. I mean, it's kind of like a very hard balance to meet, I suppose.
I'm happy to say that the Minister of Agriculture have a target that by 2025, they will be using cleaner sources to process tobacco. And we will be there to support them. There are certainly opportunities to access green climate funding for any research and technology acquisition of cleaner technologies in agriculture. Coal, we have not been able to use coal because for us we would have preferred coal over using trees. But it is again an issue of the economy. It became economically unsustainable to use coal. They resorted to the cutting of trees. But we have always said that this debate around coal has to be holistic. As you put it correctly, say we cut on our coal utilization today, electricity provision goes down. What is our next source? We are cutting trees. So we have not solved anything to do with climate change. So we need a holistic approach. And I will tell you that there was a presentation from ZESA, where from our Zambezi River we have potentially 8 hydropower stations that can be put in, generating more than 15,500 megawatts of electricity. And with our very efficient Southern Africa power pole, we could support more than 8 countries. Again, we presented this in our side meetings, that as a country, it's not that we have this affinity for coal, but we have a developmental need. Here are the projects. They need funding.
Fund them, right.
Fund them, we will transition. That's where you see the hesitation and double standards from the developed world. But we are working on that. We will certainly accelerate feasibility studies on this, and I'm happy that ZESA is way ahead in terms of that, working with Zambia.
Before I ask my final question, I just want to get back to COP26, because it appears that apart from the Glasgow Pact, Climate Pact, and all the other discussions held, there wasn't really a lot in it for Zimbabwe in terms of assisting us in our climate change fight. I mean, particularly if you look at the funding aspects, you look at the way that industrialized nations are talking about trying to reduce coal and fossil emissions, of course, methane and so on. It appears as if, in a way, all the agreement did was to highlight the things that we couldn't do, not the stuff that we could, so to speak.
So our biggest fear is that as this evolves, the debate around climate financing, the developed nations will want to use it for political leverage. And we are seeing that. You know, you will know that at one point we had Standard Chartered financing feasibility studies for several chemicals to transition into energy efficiency. And when it was at a stage where it needed financing, there were interventions from the British government, and Standard Chartered pulled out. And we hope that this will not continue, because it's marks of double standards, to put it that way. We hope that everyone is in this to fight collectively, so that we do not find ourselves having to struggle to get funding. That said, we have received close to $40 million US in the last 3 years mainly towards climate adaptation, and it has gone towards agriculture. There are projects, unfortunately, have been slowed down by the COVID pandemic. We are still doing feasibility studies. The funding has been availed. There is more that we will be applying for now that we have gone through the lengthy processes of accessing these funds. We're working with agriculture, with energy, with industry. There are a number of projects that are in the pipeline which we will submit for funding.
Minister, my final question, of course, a critical one. What is the way forward when it comes to both worldwide climate change action and putting it in the Zimbabwean perspective? Is Zimbabwe's government going to put on the table more concrete laws and steps in an effort to play its part fully?
So, from what I said initially is that Africa goes into these platforms divided. I'm happy to say that we discussed COP26 in Cabinet today, and the President has directed that there has to be a permanent interministerial committee that is looking at the implications of COP26, but also going forward, Conference of Parties negotiations, so that our position is clear. But beyond that, we intend to create a common position as SADC, because we are one region that is heavily affected by coal transition. We need to take a common position on that, but also expand it over time. Our desire is to have the climate change agenda mainstreamed at the level of African Union, so that we have that unified position going forward. We are working on a climate change bill. We have started working on it, and we hope that in 2022 it will go to Cabinet and eventually to Parliament, which sets out a lot of parameters, including legislation around setting up a framework on carbon credit trading. We believe that our commitments to reduce our emissions are quite firm, are quite ambitious, and they are quite achievable. Although we did put a condition, we said unless funding is availed, we may not be able to meet those. So that remains quite integral.
There's an integral goal of your ministry to make sure that these sort of things, these climate change laws, are stronger and strengthened within the country.
Certainly, and we work closely with other ministries like the renewable energy policy. We worked closely with the Minister of Energy, the e-mobility one. We have sourced funding for that as climate change department, and we will be looking at all other ministries and see what are the relevant laws that need to be promulgated, just to make sure that everyone is compliant with what the nation has pledged.
Of course, my guest tonight on the Mint, Honorable Mangaliso Ndlovu, is also the Minister responsible for tourism and the hospitality industry. And we will be, in a future program in the next couple of weeks, be actually having another one-on-one where we focus strictly on tourism and hospitality. So keep a lookout for on ZTN platforms for when that interview will take place. We will come to the end of the Mint this evening. I'd like to thank my guest, Honorable Mangaliso Ndlovu, Zimbabwe's Minister of Environment, Climate, Tourism and Hospitality Industry. Minister, thank you so much for coming on the Mint and discussing this critical topic.
Thank you for having me.
You've been watching The Mint, Zimbabwe's premier business show. Our discussion this evening, is Zimbabwe ready for the New World Order? And of course, the New World Order we're talking about tonight was climate change and climate action. This broadcast was brought to you by Zimpaper's TV network, ZTN. A final comment. Climate change is real, and it is here in Zimbabwe. Make no mistake about that. While COP26 didn't deliver the full range of ambitions needed to address climate change, it did provide many of the building blocks for future action. And I quote, "I know we can get there," the UN Secretary General said. "We are in a fight of our lives. Never give up, never retreat. Keep pushing forward. I'll be with you all the way. COP27 starts now." So to all of you out there, keep up the fight against climate change. It may be exactly what damages our world beyond repair. I'm Andy Hodges. Have a good night and goodbye, and please, you all be safe.